A metal detectorist found a bracelet buried deep. It solved a mystery from 1994. The beep was a high, sweet song in the salt-laced air, a sound that usually meant treasure. For Arthur Penelgon, treasure was rarely gold doubloons or pirate jewels. It was the quiet thrill of connection, a ghost from the past whispering through the sand. A Victorian silver shilling, a soldier's brass button from the Great War, a child's tin toy car, its wheels seized with rust. These were the things that made his heart hum, the small, forgotten histories of ordinary lives. He'd been sweeping the dunes of Paranporth for 40 years. His shoulders stooped from the weight of his machine and the patient arc of his swing. The setting sun bled orange and violet across the horizon, painting the wet sand in hues of bruised fruit. The tide was low, exposing a stretch of beach usually swallowed by the Atlantic. A secret place where the oldest things sometimes washed up. This beep, however, was different. It wasn't the dull grunt of iron or the flat chirp of a bottle cap. It was clean, insistent, and deep. Arthur's pulse, normally a placid rhythm against his ribs, gave a little kick. He knelt, the damp sand seeping through the knees of his worn corduroys. The Garrett Ace, 250 wailed as he brought it closer to the spot. Deep, at least 1.5 feet, maybe more. He set the detector aside and pulled his trowel from his belt. The sand was heavy, compacted by decades of tides. It was hard work, his breath coming in short, sharp puffs that misted in the cooling air. He dug carefully, methodically, his movements honed by thousands of such excavations. 10 inches down, then 12, then 14. The hole grew wider, a dark wound in the pale flesh of the beach. Finally, the trowel struck something with a soft metallic clink. Not the grating scrape of rock, but something smoother. Something that yielded slightly. Arthur's breath caught. He abandoned the trowel, his gnarled fingers stained with soil and time, probing the cold, wet sand. He felt it a thin, cool circlet. He worked his fingers around it, clearing the grit, his touch gentle, reverent. It felt small, delicate. A piece of jewelry. He hooked a finger beneath it and pulled. It came free with a soft sucking sound. The sand, reluctant to give up its secret. He held it in his palm, wiping it clean with his thumb. It wasn't a ring. It was a bracelet, slender and silver, tarnished to a dark, moody gray by its long slumber in the earth. But it was the design that made the air freeze in his lungs. It was a child's bracelet. A simple silver chain, and dangling from it were 5 tiny, exquisitely detailed charms. A seashell, a starfish, a dolphin, a lighthouse, and in the center, a small, flat heart. He turned the heart over. His eyesight wasn't what it used to be, but even in the fading light, he could make out the faint, spidery script of an engraving. He squinted, angling it toward the last vestiges of the sun. Lila forever, our light. The name hit him like a physical blow. Lila, a name that hadn't been spoken aloud in this town for 25 years, not in any real way. It was a name that lived in whispers, in sad, downward glances, in the haunted silence that fell over a pub when a certain song played on the jukebox. Lila Stern, the little girl who had vanished from this very beach on a hot August afternoon in 1994. She was 7 years old. One moment she was building a sandcastle with her red bucket and spade, her laughter carried on the breeze. The next, she was gone. The bucket and spade were still there, a half-finished turret melting in the sun. But of Lila, there was no trace. The search had been biblical. Police, helicopters, divers, hundreds of volunteers combing the dunes, the cliffs, the gorse-choked coastal paths. They'd searched for weeks, their hope eroding with every tide until all that was left was a raw, gaping wound in the community's heart. They assumed she'd been swept out to sea, a tragic accident. Her parents, a young couple from London on their first family holiday to Cornwall, were destroyed. Their grief was a terrible public spectacle, their faces pale and strained. On the evening news. Eventually, they left, and the town was left with the ghost of a little girl in a yellow sundress. Arthur's hand trembled, the bracelet suddenly feeling impossibly heavy, a leaden weight of sorrow. This was hers, It had to be, he remembered. The posters, the grainy photograph of a smiling, gap-toothed girl with bright, curious eyes. Around her wrist, just visible, was a silver chain. He'd never seen it up close, but he knew. A cold dread, colder than the Atlantic wind, crept up his spine. This wasn't just a relic. This was evidence. And it wasn't found in the surf, where something lost to the waves might wash ashore. It was buried deep in the compacted sand of the upper dunes, far from the high tide line. Things didn't just bury themselves to feet deep in sand that was almost as hard as soil. They were put there. A wave of nausea washed over him. He looked around, his familiar, beloved beach, suddenly transformed into a place of menace. The dunes, which had always seemed like sleeping giants, now felt like silent, complicit witnesses. The whisper of the marram grass was no longer soothing. It was sinister. The cry of a lone gull overhead sounded like a scream. He was alone. The last of the dog-walkers and sunset gazers had long since departed. There was only him, the encroaching darkness, and this terrible, beautiful thing in his hand. He scrambled to his feet, his old joints protesting. He had to tell someone, the police. He fumbled for his mobile, a cheap, brick-like thing he kept for emergencies. His fingers were clumsy, shaking so badly he could barely press the buttons. He dialed 999, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. "Police, please," he rasped, his voice a stranger's in his own ears. The operator's voice was calm, professional, a world away from the maelstrom in his chest. He tried to explain, stumbling over his words, the story tumbling out in a chaotic rush. The detector, the beep, the digging, the bracelet. "Lila, sir, can you give me your location?" "Paranporth Beach," he said, his voice cracking. "The far end. Near the old winch post." "Stay where you are, sir. A unit is on its way. Don't touch anything else. Secure the area as best you can." Secure the area. The words sounded absurd. The area was a vast open beach, the tide now turning, beginning its slow, inexorable march back toward him. The darkness was almost complete, the sea and sky melting into a single, featureless void. He felt a primal urge to run, to get away from this place, to leave the bracelet behind and pretend he'd never found it. To go back to his quiet life of shillings and buttons, but he couldn't. He was tethered to this spot now, tethered to the ghost of Leela Stern. He stood over the hole he had dug, a dark, accusing eye in the sand. He shone his phone's weak torch into it. Nothing, just sand. But he knew what this meant. She wasn't swept out to sea. She never left this beach. She was here. All this time, she was here. Buried somewhere beneath the shifting sands, her small bones intermingled with shells and stones. And the person who put her there, they had walked away, leaving her in a shallow, sandy grave. Their secret, safe for a quarter of a century. The wail of a distant siren began to slice through the night, growing steadily closer. Arthur looked down at the bracelet one last time before slipping it carefully into a plastic finds bag he always carried. The silver seemed to glow in the gloom, the little charms winking at him. A seashell, a starfish, a dolphin, a lighthouse, and a heart. "Lila, forever, our light." A light that had been extinguished on a summer's day in 1994. And he, Arthur Penelagon, a lonely old man with a metal detector, had just stumbled into the darkness that had hidden the truth for 25 years. The siren was closer now, its cry echoing off the cliffs. He looked out at the black churning water, and for the first time in his life, the sea didn't feel like a friend. It felt like a tomb, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his very soul, that by digging up this one small bracelet, he had just unearthed a monster. The cliffhanger wasn't just that a piece of jewelry was found. It was the dawning, horrifying realization of what its location signified. She hadn't been lost. She had been taken and buried. The monster wasn't a mythical beast from the deep. It was a person. A person who might still be out there. A person who might still be in power. The siren grew louder, a promise of order and authority, but it was no comfort. Arthur clutched the bag containing the bracelet, the plastic crinkling in his fist. He had a sudden, terrifying image of a shadow falling over a little girl building, a sandcastle of a hand reaching out, of a smile turning to a cry that was swallowed by the sound of the surf. The police would bring questions, procedures, sterile evidence bags. But he had found the story. And the story was one of unimaginable cruelty. He looked back at the hole, then at the vast, empty expanse of the beach. The person who did this had stood here, they had watched the sun set, just as he had. They had breathed this same salt air, and they had walked away with a secret that had poisoned this town for a generation. The siren was almost upon him, its blue lights flashing, painting the dunes in frantic, strobing bursts of color. But Arthur wasn't looking at the approaching police car. He was looking at the darkness, and he knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that the darkness was looking back. The first officer on the scene was young, his face still holding the earnestness of a recent graduate from training college, P.C. Evans. He treated Arthur with a gentle, slightly patronizing respect, the kind reserved for the elderly and the eccentric. He took the bracelet, handling the plastic bag with a professional detachment that Arthur found both reassuring and jarring. He asked the same questions the operator had, his pen scratching across a notepad. Arthur's answers were still disjointed, his mind a kaleidoscope of shock and horror. He pointed to the hole, a pathetic little scoop in the sand that seemed wholly inadequate to contain the magnitude of its discovery. "You're sure you haven't touched anything else, sir?" Evans asked, his torch beam dancing around the immediate area. "No, just that. Just the bracelet," Arthur mumbled, his gaze fixed on the whole dot. Another car arrived, this one unmarked. 2 figures emerged, their silhouettes sharp against the headlights. They moved with a different kind of authority. Detectives, a man and a woman. The woman introduced herself as DCI Rachel Vance. She was in her late 40s, with a sharp, intelligent face and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She didn't smile. She looked at Arthur, then at the hole, then at the plastic bag P.C. Evans was holding. Her expression was unreadable, but Arthur felt a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The procedural calm was being replaced by something more intense. A hunt was beginning. "Mr. Penelgon," she said, her voice low and steady, "I need you to tell me everything. From the moment you got here today. Don't leave anything out, no matter how small it seems." And so he did. He told her about his routine, the tide, the way he swung the detector. He described the sound of the beep, the feel of the sand, the clink of the trowel. He described the bracelet, the charms, the inscription. As he spoke, he saw the flicker of something in her eyes. Recognition. She knew the name, she knew the story. "Lila Stern," she said, the name hanging in the cold night air like a puff of frozen breath. It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. "Yes," Arthur whispered. DCI Vance knelt by the hole, her movements fluid and precise. She didn't touch anything. She just looked, her gaze sweeping back and forth, taking in the texture of the sand, the depth of the excavation, the proximity to the dunes and the sea. The male detective, a burly man named D.S. Miller, started issuing quiet orders into his radio. The beach, Arthur's sanctuary, was being transformed. It was no longer a place of peace, it was a crime scene. Tape was being unspooled, bright blue and white against the pale sand. Floodlights were being erected, casting a harsh, artificial glare that bleached the color from the world, turning the dunes into lunar landscapes. A forensics tent was going up, a stark white marquee that looked like a monstrous mushroom sprouting. From the sand, Arthur felt adrift, a ghost at his own discovery. He had unearthed this horror, and now it had been taken from him, passed into the hands of these professionals who dealt with the darkness as a matter of routine. He watched them work, a swarm of activity around the small hole he had dug. They were photographing it from every angle, taking samples of the sand, measuring, marking. It was a slow, painstaking process, a ritual of evidence gathering. He thought about Leela's parents. Where were they now? Did they still think of this place? Did the sound of waves still bring them to their knees? For 25 years, they had lived with the agony of not knowing. They had pictured their daughter lost to the vast, indifferent ocean. A terrible fate, but one with a certain clean, natural tragedy to it. But this was different. This was the work of a human hand. This was malice. This was a secret kept, a life stolen and hidden away. The truth, he realized, was going to be so much worse than the lie they had been living with. He felt a hand on his arm. It was DCI Vance. Her eyes were softer now, a hint of empathy breaking through the professional mask. "Mr. Penelgon, you've done a very important thing tonight," she said. "But you must be in shock. We need to take a formal statement, but we can do that at the station. My officer will take you home for now. We'll be in touch in the morning." Home. The words sounded foreign. How could he go home to his quiet cottage, with its collection of sea-smoothed glass and driftwood, and not see that bracelet in his mind's eye? How could he sleep? As PC Evans led him away from the controlled chaos, back towards the car park, Arthur took one last look over his shoulder. The beach was unrecognizable, a sterile illuminated grid of scientific inquiry. The flash had erased the sunset, the stars, the magic. All that was left was the cold, hard reality of what lay beneath the sand. And as he got into the police car, the door closing with a solid final thud, he knew that this was just the beginning. The bracelet was the key, but the lock was a quarter of a century of lies. The monster he had unearthed wasn't just a killer. It was a memory, and it was about to tear this town apart. The cliffhanger was not just a discovery, but the unleashing of a dormant poison. The bracelet was not just a clue, it was a catalyst. And as the police car pulled away, leaving the floodlit beach behind, Arthur Penelgon, the quiet man who collected ghosts, felt the chilling certainty that the most terrifying ghost of all was the one that was still alive. The news broke like a fever. By morning, it was on every local radio station. A headline on the BBC Cornwall website, a ripple of hushed conversations in the spa and the post office. Human remains, feared found on Perranporth Beach. 1994 disappearance of Lila Stern reopened. The discovery of the bracelet was the spark, but DCI Vance, knowing the storm that was coming, had fast-tracked a preliminary ground-penetrating radar survey of the area Arthur had indicated. The results, delivered just before dawn, were grimly conclusive. An anomaly, a disturbance in the deep strata of sand, roughly 4 feet down, consistent with a burial. The size and shape were ambiguous, but there was no doubt they had found Lila's grave. The victim, Lila Stern, was resurrected in the public imagination, not as a person, but as a tragic icon. The same photograph was everywhere. The gap-toothed smile, the bright inquisitive eyes, the yellow sundress. She was summer. She was innocence. She was the ghost who haunted the Cornish coast, a cautionary tale whispered to children who strayed too close to the water's edge. In the old newspaper clippings pulled from the archives, her parents, Mark and Sarah Stern, were frozen in time. Their faces etched with a raw, uncomprehending grief. Mark, a young architect with a kind face, his arm wrapped protectively around his wife. Sarah, a freelance illustrator, her artist's eyes wide with a horror that seemed to see past the cameras and into some private, unbearable abyss. They had spoken of Leela in the present tense, then, their words, desperate prayers. "She's a strong swimmer for her age," Mark had told a reporter, his voice thick with unshed tears. "She's resourceful. If anyone can find her way back, it's our Leela." Sarah had simply held up Leela's favorite teddy bear, its button eyes staring blankly. Her own silence, a scream of anguish. They were the perfect victims, their pain cinematic and relatable. After the search was called off, they had retreated from the world, selling their London home and disappearing, wanting only to grieve in private. They had become as much a part of the legend as their daughter, but a legend has no texture, no secrets. The real Leela, the real Sarah, the real Mark, were more complex. Sarah's sister, Chloe, was the keeper of that complexity. Now a frazzled, but fiercely protective primary school teacher in Bristol, Chloe had been there that summer. She'd been 17, a moody, artistic teenager, tasked with helping her older sister with the energetic She remembered the tension that had simmered beneath the surface of that idyllic family holiday. Mark, stressed about a big project, was often on the phone, his voice sharp and impatient. Sarah, who had suffered from postpartum depression after Lila was born, was fragile, her smiles often not quite reaching her haunted eyes. She painted watercolors of the churning sea, her canvases filled with dark, turbulent blues and grays that seemed at odds with the sunny weather. Chloe remembered the day Leela disappeared with a clarity that felt like a curse. The heat was oppressive, the air thick and still. Mark had stayed at the holiday cottage, glued to a conference call. Sarah had seemed distant, lost in her own thoughts, rubbing her temples as if to ward off a migraine. It was Chloe who had played with Lila, who had helped her build the sandcastle, who had listened to her chatter about the mermaids she was convinced lived in the rock pools. And it was Chloe who had looked away. Just for a moment, a boy from the year above her at school, a boy with floppy hair and a cocky grin, had walked past. He'd called her name. She'd turned, her face flushing, her heart giving a stupid teenage flutter. They'd talked for maybe 5 minutes. No more than that. When she turned back, the beach was the same. The sun was the same. The half-finished sandcastle was the same. But the small figure in the yellow sundress was gone. The guilt had been a cancer in her soul for 25 years. She was the last one to see Leela. She was the one who was supposed to be watching. The police had questioned her, of course, but she was just a kid, her testimony lost in the larger tragedy. She'd told them about the boy, but he had an alibi, seen by a dozen people at the other end of the beach. So the blame, unspoken but ever present, had settled on her. Sarah had never accused her, but a coldness had entered their relationship, an invisible wall of grief and resentment that had never fully crumbled. Chloe had lived her life in the shadow of that one careless moment. She had become a teacher to surround herself with the laughter of children, a constant, painful penance. When the news broke about the bracelet, Chloe felt the ground give way beneath her. The monster she had imagined for years, the rogue wave, the sudden riptide, was gone. In its place was a human face, and the terror of that was infinitely worse. The antagonist, in 1994, was a man nobody noticed, Julian Croft. He was a groundskeeper at the caravan park that overlooked the beach. A quiet, solitary man in his late 20s. He was handsome in a gaunt, hollow-eyed way, with a stillness about him that people mistook for shyness. He lived in a small, damp, static caravan at the edge of the park, a place that always smelled of stale cigarette smoke and boiled cabbage. He was the man who trimmed the hedges, mowed the small patches of grass, and emptied the bins. He was part of the background, a fixture as unremarkable as a lamppost. But Julian Croft had a secret. His stillness was not shyness. It was the coiled patience of a predator. His broken past was a litany of petty cruelties and resentments. He'd grown up in care, shuffled from one foster home to another, a childhood of slammed doors and casual neglect. He felt invisible, a ghost in his own life. The world to him was a place of bright, happy families who had what he could never have. He watched them from his caravan, his heart a cold, hard knot of envy. He saw them on the beach, their laughter grating on his nerves, their easy affection a personal insult. He hated them. He hated their sunshine, their sandcastles, their love. That summer, he had watched the Sterns. He'd watched the anxious, important father and the sad, beautiful mother. And he had watched the girl, Leela. She was everything he loathed and coveted. She was cherished. She was adored. She was a light, and he was the darkness. He had watched her for days, learning her rhythms, her favorite spots on the beach. He saw the teenage aunt, distracted and dreamy. He saw the mother, lost in her own world. He saw the opportunity. On that hot, still afternoon, when the aunt turned her back, he had made his move. It was so simple. He'd knelt by the sandcastle, his shadow falling over hers. He'd told her he'd found a special shell, a mermaid's purse, just around the corner, in a little cove hidden by the rocks. He'd smiled, and she, a child, taught to be polite, had smiled back and taken his hand. No one saw No one noticed the quiet groundskeeper leading a little girl in a yellow sundress away from the crowded beach. It was the perfect crime, a ghost committing a murder in plain sight. He had taken her to the dunes, to a place he had prepared, a place where the sound of the surf would swallow any cry. And when it was done, he had buried her, along with her bright, shining light, deep in the sand. Then he had gone back to his caravan, made a cup of tea, and watched the frantic search begin, a cold, satisfying thrill spreading through his chest. For the first time in his life, he had made a mark on the world. He had taken their light and made it his own. For 25 years, Julian Croft had lived with his secret. He'd left Perranporth a year later, drifting from one menial job to another, always staying on the fringes, always watching. He was a security guard now, living in a small neat bungalow in a dreary suburb of Plymouth. He was 52, his gaunt handsomeness replaced by a grey, anonymous middle age. He followed the news. He knew about the metal detectorist. He saw the picture of the bracelet, and a tremor of something not fear, but a strange, possessive pride went through him. It was his story, his secret, and it was finally being told. He felt no remorse, only a sense of ownership. He had been the architect of this tragedy, and the world was finally catching up to his genius. And then there was the hidden witness. In 1994, he was a boy named David Kelsey. He was 10 years old, a quiet, nerdy kid on holiday with his parents. He was obsessed with birds, and he spent his days hiding in the dunes with his father's binoculars, hoping to spot a rare seabird. He was small for his age, and he had learned that the best way to avoid the boisterous, sand-kicking older kids was to make himself invisible. From his vantage point, high in the marram grass, he saw everything. He had a clear, unobstructed view of the beach. He saw Leela in her yellow dress. He saw her teenage aunt. He saw the aunt turn away to talk to the floppy-haired boy. And he saw the man. He didn't know who he was, but he recognized him as the man who emptied the bins at their caravan. He saw him kneel by the sandcastle. He saw him talk to the little girl. He saw her take his hand. He saw them walk away together, towards the secluded cove at the base of the cliffs. It seemed innocent. Enough. A friendly man helping a little girl look for shells. But something about it made David feel uneasy. The man hadn't smiled at the girl. He had smiled at the ants, turned back. It was a small detail, but it had snagged in his 10-year-old mind. He had waited for them to come back. He kept his binoculars. Trained on the cove, they didn't return. After a while, he saw the ant turn back, a frown on her face. He saw her look around, her frown deepening into panic. He saw her start to call Leela's name. He saw the beginning of the chaos. And he was afraid. He knew he had seen something important, but he was a shy, timid boy. He was scared of the police. Scared of getting into trouble, scared of the man. What if the man saw him? What if he came for him next? So he said nothing. He kept the secret, locked away, a heavy stone in his gut. The guilt had shaped his life. He had grown up to be an accountant, a man who dealt in numbers and certainties, a profession as far removed from the grey ambiguities of human behavior as he could find. He was meticulous, cautious, risk-averse. He had never married. He had never been back to Perranporth. Now David Kelsey was 45. He lived in a sterile minimalist apartment in Reading, his life a fortress of order against the chaos of his childhood memory. When he saw the news report, the photograph of Lila, the mention of the groundskeeper from the caravan park being a person of interest. Though his name had not yet been released, David felt the stone in his gut begin to crumble. He saw the man's face in his mind's eye. The ghost of a smile that wasn't a smile. He saw the little girl's hand in his. He had been a witness. He was still a witness. For 25 years, his silence had protected a monster. The fear was still there, a cold, familiar phantom. But now, for the first time, it was joined by something else. A flicker of resolve. The boy who hid in the dunes was gone. In his place was a man who knew that his numbers could never add up. That his ledgers could never be balanced, until he paid the debt he had owed for a quarter of a century. He opened his laptop, his hands shaking, and searched for the number of the Cornwall Police Headquarters. The time for hiding was over. The past was no longer a memory, it was a summons. The introduction of these three characters, the grieving sister, the hidden killer, the silent witness, sets the stage for the escalating conflict. Each of them holds a piece of the puzzle, their lives irrevocably intertwined by a single moment on a sunny beach. Chloe's guilt, Julian's psychopathy, and David's fear are the emotional currents that will now collide, energized by the unearthing of a small silver bracelet. The police, led by the tenacious DCI Vance, have the grave, but they don't have the story. The story lives inside these three people, a toxic secret that has festered for 25 years, waiting for the light. The stage is set, the players are in position, and the curtain is about to rise on a drama of betrayal, cruelty, and the devastating cost of truth. The initial shock has subsided, replaced by the chilling, intimate portraits of the lives shattered and twisted by Leela's disappearance. The narrative is no longer just about a cold case. It's about the living, breathing consequences of that day, and the storm that is about to break over them all. DCI Vance's investigation began to move with relentless, methodical speed. The excavation of the grave was a somber, painstaking affair, conducted under the sterile glare of floodlights and the watchful eye of the national media. The discovery of Leela's skeletal remains was confirmed, and the nation's grief was renewed, sharper and more terrible this time. The fantasy of the sea had been replaced by the brutal reality of a shallow grave. The post-mortem, conducted by a Home Office pathologist, was harrowing. There were no signs of a weapon, no broken bones. The cause of death was asphyxiation. Suffocated. The horror of that one word, clinical and stark, sent a fresh wave of revulsion through the country. The bracelet, cleaned and polished in the forensics lab, became a symbol of the investigation. DCI Vance made a public appeal, holding up a photograph of the delicate silver chain. "We believe the person who did this may have kept a secret for 25 years, she said, her voice steady, her gaze boring into the camera lens. But secrets have a weight. They are a burden. We know someone out there has the answer. It's time to put that burden down." The appeal, combined with the republication of old case files, brought a flood of calls. Old holidaymakers, former residents, people with half-forgotten memories of a man who seemed a bit odd, or a car that seemed out of place. Most of it was noise. But one call, rooted through a hesitant, trembling voice, cut through the static. It was David Kelsey. I was there," he stammered to the operator. "I was a boy, I saw her. I saw her with a man." D.S. Miller took the call, his gruff demeanor softening as he realized what he was hearing. He listened patiently as David, his voice cracking with a quarter-century of repressed guilt, recounted the story of the man from the caravan park, the bin man, leading the little girl away. He described the man's face, his clothes, the strange, cold smile. He couldn't give them a name, but he gave them something better: a face, an action, a timeline. The information was electric. It corroborated the vague whispers from other callers about a loner groundskeeper. The police archives from 1994 were scoured. And there he was. Julian Croft, employed at the Paranporth Sands Caravan Park from 1992 to 1995. A single, grainy staff photograph showed a gaunt, dark-haired man in his late 20s, his eyes hollow, his mouth set in a thin, unsmiling line. It was him. The injustice began to escalate, but not in the way the police expected. The media, hungry for a villain, seized on the new information. Julian Croft's name was leaked. His face, both the old staff photo and a recent surreptitiously taken shot of a grey anonymous man getting into a Ford Focus, was splashed across every front page and news website. He was tried and convicted in the court of public opinion before DCI Vance had even had a chance to bring him in for questioning. His bungalow in Plymouth was besieged by reporters and camera crews, his curtains permanently drawn. Graffiti appeared on his wall. Monster, child killer. For Julian, this was not a punishment, it was a coronation. He sat in his darkened living room, the television on mute, watching his own face on the screen. The fear and hatred in the eyes of the reporters, the anger in the headlines, it was intoxicating. He had been invisible for so long, and now he was the most famous man in Britain. He was the center of the story. They called him a monster, and he felt a surge of pride. He was the wolf they had never seen, and now they were howling at his door. He felt no fear, only a cold, thrilling sense of power. He had orchestrated this. This was his masterpiece. His cruelty, dormant for so long, began to reawaken. He decided to play with them. When the police finally came for him, he was ready. He opened the door before they could knock, a calm, slightly quizzical expression on his face. "Can I help you, officers?" he asked, his voice a reedy tenor, the picture of bewildered innocence. In the interview room, he was a rock of denial. He sat perfectly still, his hands folded on the table, his gaze unwavering. DCI Vance and DS Miller questioned him for hours, their questions a relentless barrage. His alibi for that day was flimsy, non-existent. He claimed he couldn't remember. "It was 25 years ago," he said, with a small, dismissive shrug. "I was probably mowing a lawn somewhere." He denied ever speaking to Leela. He denied ever seeing her up close. When they showed him the photograph of the bracelet, he squinted at it with polite curiosity. "It's very pretty," he said. "A terrible tragedy. What happened to that little girl?" I remember how upset everyone was. His performance was flawless. He was the wronged man, the victim of a media witch hunt. His life ruined by a faulty memory from a traumatized child. The injustice fell most heavily on Chloe. The reopening of the case had ripped the scar tissue from her soul. She had given her statement to the police, her voice thick with guilt as she recounted her 5 minutes of teenage distraction. The press, unable to get to the Sterns, who were now in seclusion under police protection, turned their attention to her. She was the sister, the aunt, the one who was there. She was hounded, her phone ringing off the hook, reporters camping outside her school. A particularly vicious tabloid ran a headline, "The Aunt Who Turned Her Back." The article was a masterpiece of insinuation, painting her as a flighty, irresponsible teenager whose carelessness had led to Lila's death. The old photograph of her, 17 and sullen, was juxtaposed with the smiling face of her niece. The public, inflamed by the story, needed someone to blame. And with Julian Croft stonewalling, Chloe became an easy target. She received hate. Male vicious comments appeared on her school's social media page. Parents whispered in the playground. The betrayal was brutal. She had carried this guilt privately for 25 years. And now it was being served up for public consumption, twisted and magnified. She felt herself starting to unravel. The carefully constructed life she had built, crumbling around her. Sister Sarah was no comfort. Brought out of their self-imposed exile by the news, Lila's parents were cocooned by family liaison officers. When Chloe finally managed to speak to Sarah on the phone, the conversation was strained and cold. Sarah's voice was flat, devoid of emotion. "They think it was him, Chloe," Sarah said, her voice a dead monotone. "I know," Chloe whispered, desperate for a word of connection, of shared grief. "Sarah, I'm so sorry." "Sorry doesn't bring her back," Sarah said, and the line went dead. The words were a knife in Chloe's heart. The wall between them, built on the day Lila disappeared, was now higher and thicker than ever. Sarah, consumed by her own renewed grief, couldn't see past her own pain to the agony of her sister. She blamed the world, and Chloe was part of that world. The conflict escalated further when Julian Croft, after 48 hours of questioning, was released on bail. There was not enough direct evidence to charge him. David Kelsey's witness. The statement was compelling, but it was the memory of a 10-year-old boy, now a man of 4. It placed Julian with Leela, but it didn't prove murder. The bracelet had no fingerprints, no DNA after 25 years in the sand. The circumstantial evidence was strong, but the Crown Prosecution Service was cautious. They needed more. Julian's release was a calculated act of cruelty. He walked out of the police station into a scrum of cameras. his lawyer by his side, a small triumphant smirk playing on his lips. "My client is innocent," the lawyer announced. "He is the victim of a media circus and a hysterical mob. He understands the public's grief, but that grief has been tragically misdirected." Julian, standing behind him, looked directly into the cameras. He looked broken, he looked afraid. It was a masterful performance. He was the new victim, and he knew exactly who was watching. He knew Chloe was watching, he knew David was watching, and he wanted them to feel his power. For David Kelsey, Julian's release was a waking nightmare. He had done the right thing. He had finally spoken up, and it had changed nothing. Worse, it had made him a target. His name had also been leaked to the press. He was the man who pointed the finger. His quiet, ordered life was shattered. He had to take a leave of absence from his job. He felt watched, his anonymity stripped away. The fear he had lived with his whole life came roaring back, stronger than ever. He began to doubt himself. Was his memory accurate? Had he ruined an innocent man's life? The thought was torment. Julian, emboldened, began to turn the screw. He gave an exclusive interview to the same tabloid that had vilified Chloe. The headline was explosive: "My hell. I'm the real victim here." In the article, he spoke of his quiet life, his love of gardening, his shock at being accused of such a monstrous crime. He spoke of his sympathy for the Stern family, but he also planted a seed of poison. "One has to wonder about the family," he mused, his words dripping with false sincerity. The aunt, who was supposed to be watching her, the parents, who were arguing. It's a tragedy all around. He was deflecting, redirecting the narrative, painting a picture of a dysfunctional family, a careless teenager. He was making Chloe the villain of his story. The article was a devastating blow. Chloe, already fragile, began to break. The public shaming was unbearable. She stopped leaving her house. She saw accusation in every eye. The school, under pressure from parents, asked her to take an extended leave of absence. She was being erased, her life dismantled piece by piece by a man she had never met. A monster who was now wearing the mask of a victim. DCI Vance was furious, but her hands were tied. Julian was playing the game perfectly, staying just on the right side of the law. The investigation was stalling. The forensic search of Julian's bungalow had yielded nothing. He was a meticulous man. There were no souvenirs, no trophies, no diaries, nothing to link him to 1994. The case was going cold again, smothered by Julian's cunning and the media's fickle narrative. The tension was becoming unbearable. Chloe was isolated and terrified. David was racked with doubt and fear. Sarah and Mark Stern were trapped in their grief, unable to see the new injustice being perpetrated in their daughter's name, and Julian Croft, the architect of it all, was free, enjoying his celebrity, his cruelty escalating with every passing day. He had turned their pain into his stage, and he was giving the performance of a lifetime. The public was starting to believe him. The monster was convincing the world that the real monsters were his victims. The conflict had reached a fever pitch, a brutal public humiliation that was destroying innocent lives while the guilty man watched and smiled. The scales of justice were not just unbalanced, they were being deliberately, sadistically, tipped in favor of the darkness. And DCI Vance knew, with a growing sense of desperation, that unless something changed, unless a new piece of evidence surfaced, the monster was going to win. The investigation was on life support. DCI Vance and her team were hitting a wall of carefully constructed lies. Julian Croft, now a minor celebrity, had launched a lawsuit against the police for wrongful arrest and against several newspapers for libel. He was a master of manipulation. His public persona, a carefully crafted image of a gentle, misunderstood man caught in a nightmare. He had effectively neutralized David Kelsey's testimony by painting him as an unreliable, publicity-seeking fantasies. He had shattered Chloe's life, turning her into a public pariah. The official narrative was fraying, the moral clarity of the case dissolving into a murky swamp of doubt and recrimination. Vance felt the truth slipping through her fingers. a tangible thing being lost to a more compelling fiction. The twist, when it came, did not come from a high-tech lab or a clever piece of detective work. It came from the past, from a box of dusty, forgotten videotapes stored in the attic of a house in Bristol. It came from Chloe. Broken and isolated, Chloe had retreated into herself. Her house a fortress against the world's judgment. Her forced leave from her job had left her with nothing but time, and time was a cruel companion. She spent her days adrift in a sea of memory and regret, the events of 1994 playing on a loop in her mind. One rainy afternoon, desperate for a distraction, for some tangible proof of the happy times before the darkness fell, she decided to go through old family things. She went up to the attic, a place she hadn't visited in years, a dusty repository of forgotten lives. In the corner, under a faded floral sheet, was a stack of cardboard boxes labeled with her mother's neat handwriting. Family Holidays, 1990-1995. Her hands trembled as she sliced the tape on the box marked 94. Inside were photo albums, postcards, and a collection of old VHS tapes, the small kind that fit into a bulky camcorder. Her father had been obsessed with his new video camera that year, documenting everything. Chloe pulled out the tapes, a wave of nostalgia and dread washing over her. She didn't have a player for these small cassettes anymore. But she remembered the adapter, the larger VHS cassette that the small one slotted into. She found it at the bottom of the box. Downstairs, she unearthed the old VCR from a cupboard, blowing a thick layer of dust from its top. She hooked it up to the television, her heart pounding. She didn't know what she was looking for. A glimpse of Leela's smile. A reminder of a world that no longer existed. She slid the first tape into the adapter and pushed it into the machine. Screen flickered to life, a wash of static, and then, a jolt of color and sound. It was the holiday cottage in Pranporth. The quality was grainy, the sound tinny, but it was real. There was her father, younger, happier, behind the camera, his voice a cheerful commentary. There was her mother, Sarah, forcing a smile, her fragility achingly apparent. And there was Lila, a whirlwind of 7-year-old energy in her yellow sundress, her laughter filling the small room. Chloe watched for hours, tape after tape, tears streaming down her face. It was beautiful, and it was torture. She saw them at the beach, on the cliffs, in the village. She saw herself, a gawky 17-year-old, trying to look cool and bored, but unable to hide her affection for her niece. She was about to give up the emotional toll too much to bear, when she put in the last tape. It was labeled, Leela's Beach. Day, August 23, 1994. The day she disappeared, her breath caught. The tape began with Lila showing off the sandcastle they had just started building. "This is the Mermaid King's castle," she announced proudly to the camera, "and Auntie Chloe is the queen." Chloe saw herself roll her eyes. A perfect caricature of teenage disdain, but she was smiling. Her father, behind the camera, chuckled then. The camera panned away from them, sweeping across the crowded beach. Her father was narrating. "And here's the bustling metropolis of Pranporth. On a Tuesday, a sea of humanity. Wall-to-wall sunbathers." The camera moved slowly, a clumsy, amateurish panorama. It swept past families, couples, kids playing in the surf. And then, it stopped. Her father had zoomed in slightly, focusing on something in the distance, near the dunes. "And there's the local wildlife," he said, his voice amused. "The ever-vigilant groundskeeper, keeping us all safe from rogue blades of grass." Chloe leaned forward, her heart stopping. The camera was focused on a man, standing by a bin, his back to them. He was tall and thin, wearing the dark green overalls of the caravan park staff. He was pretending to be busy with the bin, but he wasn't. He was watching them. The camera held on him for a few seconds, an insignificant detail in a home movie. Then, the man turned his head slightly, as if sensing the camera, and looked directly towards them. His face was in profile, but it was clear. The gaunt features, the hollow eyes. It was Julian Croft. Chloe's blood ran cold. But that wasn't the shocking part. The shocking part was what he was doing. As he turned, he raised a hand to his face, scratching his cheek, and on his wrist, for a fleeting second, caught in the bright summer sun, was a flash of silver. A bracelet. A thin silver chain, with something dangling from it. It was identical to the one Leela was wearing. Chloe gasped, fumbling for the remote, her fingers clumsy with shock. She rewound the tape, her mind reeling. She played it again, and again. There it was, unmistakable. A man's wrist. A child's bracelet. Why? Why would a man be wearing a little girl's bracelet? Unless it wasn't his. Unless he'd had another one? A copy. The full monstrous conspiracy bloomed in her mind, a flower of pure evil. This wasn't a spontaneous act. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. This was planned. He had a duplicate bracelet. He had watched them. He knew about the charms, the design. He had procured a copy. For what purpose? The answer was sickeningly clear. To swap it, to take Lila's real bracelet from her, and replace it with the duplicate. Why? So that if she was ever found, if her body ever washed ashore, the bracelet would still be on her wrist, reinforcing the narrative that she had been swept out to sea, her jewelry intact. It was a piece of meticulous, diabolical planning designed to erase any suspicion of foul play. But he had made a mistake. In his arrogance, in his obsession, he had worn the duplicate himself. Perhaps he was testing it, getting used to the feel of it. Perhaps it was part of his ritual, his fantasy. A way of possessing her even before he had taken her. And her father, in his random sweeping panorama of the beach, had caught him. A ghost in the machine. A secret hidden in plain sight for 25 years. But there was more. Chloe kept watching, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The camera panned away from Julian, back to Lila. Her father was talking to her, asking her about the sandcastle. Then the tape flickered. There was a brief, jarring cut, a few seconds of black screen. When the picture returned, the scene was the same, but the audio was different. Her father must have accidentally pressed the record button again later without realizing, taping over a few seconds of the original footage. The new audio was muffled, indistinct. It was a phone conversation. Her father must have put the camera down on a table back at the cottage while he was on a call, forgetting it was still recording. The lens was pointing at the floor, so the screen was just a blurry image of the carpet. But the sound was there. It was her father's voice, low and angry. "I don't care what he says. I need that money transferred today," he was saying. "The whole project is on the line." No, she doesn't know the full extent of it. She thinks it's just a cash flow problem. "If she knew we were about to lose the house," a woman's voice replied, too faint to make out the words. "Just get it done," her father snapped, and the recording ended. Chloe felt a wave of sickness. Her parents' marriage, their whole life, had been a lie. The stress mark was under wasn't he, just a big project. They were on the verge of bankruptcy. Sarah's fragility wasn't just postpartum depression. It was the terror of a woman who knew something was deeply wrong but was being kept in the dark. The idyllic family holiday was a desperate facade, a last gasp of normality before the storm broke. This changed everything. It didn't excuse Julian Croft. It didn't change his guilt, but it recontextualized the entire tragedy. It explained Sarah's distance, Mark's distraction. It explained the tension Chloe had felt but couldn't name. And it gave the police a motive for why the Stearns had disappeared so completely. After the search was called off, they weren't just fleeing their grief. They were fleeing financial ruin, public humiliation. The personal pain of Leela's loss was now intertwined with a public scandal. The perfect victims were not so perfect after all. Their story was a messy, complicated tragedy of secrets and lies, a house of cards that had collapsed on that terrible summer afternoon. Chloe sat in the silent living room, the television screen humming, the ghosts of the past swirling around her. She held the videotape in her hand. It was a bomb. The image of Julian Croft wearing the duplicate bracelet was the physical evidence DCI Vance needed. The irrefutable link that would destroy his carefully constructed alibi. The audio of her father's phone call was a different kind of explosion, one that would shatter the carefully preserved myth of her family. The stakes had shifted. This was no longer just about finding justice for Lila. It was about exposing a web of deceit that had ensnared everyone. Her fear, her guilt, her grief, or grief to all coalesced into a single hard point of resolve. The truth, the whole, ugly, complicated truth, it was the only thing that mattered now. She picked up her phone, her fingers steady for the first time in weeks. She didn't call her sister, she didn't call her parents, she called the one person who had believed in the truth from the beginning. DCI Vance, she said, her voice clear and strong. It's Chloe Williams. I think I've found something. You need to see this. The tension, which had been a slow, grinding pressure, was now cranked to its absolute maximum. The hidden clue had surfaced, and it was more powerful than anyone could have imagined. It was a key that would unlock not just a murder, but a generation of secrets. The game had changed. And Chloe, the broken victim, was now the one holding all the cards. The public scandal was about to erupt, and it would be more shocking, more devastating, and more cathartic than anyone was prepared for. The videotape changed the tempo of the investigation from a slow march to a full gallop charge. DCI Vance watched the footage in a darkened viewing suite, her face a mask of grim concentration. Beside her, D.S. Miller let out a low whistle. The image of Julian Croft, turning his head, the silver bracelet flashing on his wrist, was damning. It was the linchpin, the piece of incontrovertible proof they had been desperately searching for. The audio of Mark Stern's phone call was a secondary shockwave, but Vance filed it away. That was a family tragedy. The bracelet was a killer's mistake. Armed with the new evidence, the CPS moved immediately. There would be no more bail. More press conferences from a smug lawyer. The cinematic payoff would not be a dramatic courtroom confession, but something more modern, more immediate, and more brutal. Public exposure in the digital age, the arrest was planned with military precision. Julian Croft was still enjoying his newfound status as a professional victim. He had agreed to appear on a popular live morning television show, Britain Today, to talk about his ordeal. It was the height of his arrogance, his final victory lap. He believed he was untouchable. He was wrong. The set of Britain Today was a symphony of bright colors and forced cheerfulness. The two hosts, a handsome man with unnaturally white teeth and a woman with a relentlessly sunny disposition, welcomed Julian to the sofa. He was dressed in a soft gray jumper. His expression one of gentle, weary sadness. He was the picture of wronged innocence. Julian, thank you for being brave enough to join us. The female host began, her voice dripping with sympathy. It must have been a living hell for you. It has, Julian said, his voice soft, almost a whisper. To be accused of something so monstrous. My life has been destroyed. He spoke eloquently about the pain of being judged by the media. The horror of having his face associated with such a terrible crime. He was compelling. He was believable. In the gallery, the show's producer was ecstatic. This was television gold. Meanwhile, DCI Vance and her team were moving. They weren't storming the studio. That would be too chaotic, too theatrical. Their plan was more insidious. They had liaised with the show's producers, who, upon being shown a warrant and a still from the video, had turned from gleeful opportunists to sober accomplices in a heartbeat. The public's right to know, in this case, was about to be served up live on air. Back on the sofa, the male host leaned forward. The police case seems to have stalled. They have no forensic evidence. All they have is the testimony of one man, David Kelsey, who was a child at the time. What would you say to him? Julian sighed, a deep, sorrowful sound. I would say that I forgive him. He was a child. He was traumatized by what happened on that beach. I believe he thinks he saw me, but memory is a fragile thing. I believe he is mistaken. It was a masterful stroke, casting himself as the benevolent, forgiving victim. In homes across Britain, people were nodding in sympathy. The monster was winning. Well, the host said, a new, harder edge to his voice. "We have a clip we'd like to show you. It's from a family home video, taken on the day Lila Stern disappeared." On the same beach, a flicker of surprise, then annoyance, crossed Julian's face. This wasn't in the pre-interview briefing. On the large screen behind the sofa, the screen that had been showing the show's logo, the grainy footage from Chloe's videotape began to play. The panoramic shot of the beach, the sound of Lila's laughter, and then, the zoom. The camera focused on the figure by the bin. Julian's face went rigid. His eyes were locked on the screen. He was watching a ghost. He was watching himself, 25 years younger, caught in a moment he never knew had been recorded. The studio was silent. The hosts, the crew, the millions watching at home were holding their breath. The camera on the show zoomed in on Julian's face, capturing the subtle shift from confusion to dawning horror. On the screen behind him, the figure of his younger self turned. The hand came up. The silver bracelet flashed in the sun. The host's voice was cold, clinical. "Mr. Croft, the police have identified the bracelet Lila Stern was wearing. It was a custom piece. They have also identified the bracelet you are wearing in this video. It is an exact duplicate. Can you explain why you were wearing a copy of a 7-year-old girl's bracelet on the day she was murdered?" Checkmate. Julian Croft stared, his mouth slightly agape. The mask of the gentle victim shattered into a million pieces. In its place was the raw, naked face of a predator caught in a trap. His eyes darted around, looking for an escape, but there was none. He was surrounded by cameras, by lights, by the silent, accusing gaze of millions. He didn't speak, he couldn't. A strange gurgling sound came from his throat. His carefully constructed world, his 25-year-old secret, had been demolished. In 30 seconds of grainy video on live television, the host pressed on, his voice like a surgeon's scalpel. "Can you explain it, Mr. Croft? Or would you like to explain it to DCI Vance, who is waiting for you in the studio's green room?" The camera held on Julian's face. The public didn't just see a liar, they saw a monster. The transformation was absolute, horrifying, and utterly compelling. His composure crumbled, replaced by a twitching, feral panic. He looked like a cornered rat. He lunged from the sofa, trying to run, but he was clumsy, disoriented. He tripped over a coffee table, sending mugs of water crashing to the floor. Before he could get up, 2 plainclothes officers, who had been posing as studio security, were on him, pinning him to the ground. His microphone was still live, broadcasting his hoarse, animalistic gasps of fear and rage across the nation. The public arrest was the cinematic payoff in its most potent form. It wasn't just justice, it was humiliation. It was the stripping away of a carefully crafted lie in the most public forum imaginable. The man who had manipulated the media was destroyed by it. The man who had hidden in the shadows was exposed. In the brightest of lights, the aftermath was immediate and explosive. The clip went viral, replayed on a loop on every news channel, shared millions of times on social media. The public's sympathy turned to righteous, white-hot fury. The narrative didn't just shift, it was obliterated. There were no more doubts, no more ambiguities. There was only the image of Julian Croft's face, contorted in guilt, and the sound of his animalistic panic. For the other players in the drama, the moment was a cathartic explosion. David Kelsey watched it from his apartment in Reading, tears of relief streaming down his face. The stone of guilt in his gut finally dissolved. He wasn't a fantasist, he was a witness. His memory was true. He had seen what he had seen. Chloe watched it with her sister. DCI Vance had arranged for them to be together, in a safe, quiet place. When the bracelet flashed on the screen, Sarah let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. She grabbed Chloe's hand, her grip like iron. The wall between them, the wall that had stood for 25 years, crumbled into dust. In that moment, they were not the victim's mother and the careless aunt. They were just 2 sisters, united in their grief and in the terrible, cleansing fire of the truth. The second part of the tape, the audio of their father's phone call, was handled more delicately. DCI Vance played it for them in private. The secret of their family's financial ruin came out, another ghost laid to rest. It was painful, another layer of betrayal to process, but it was the truth. And in the wake of Julian Croft's public immolation, the smaller, more intimate truths seemed manageable. The story was no longer about their family's failings. It was about him. It was about Leela. The final act of the payoff belonged to Julian Croft. Faced with the irrefutable video evidence, his carefully constructed world in ruins, he broke in the interrogation room. The smug, calculating manipulator was gone. In his place was a hollowed out shell of a man, he confessed, not in a flood of remorse, but in a flat, dead monotone, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. He told them everything: the planning, the duplicate bracelet, the way he had lured Leela away, the murder, the burial. He spared them no detail, his words a final, obscene act of ownership over his crime. He wanted them to know how clever he had been. The public exposure was complete. The scales of justice had been slammed back into place with a force that shook the nation. The cinematic payoff was not just an arrest. It was a public execution of a lie. It was the raw, unfiltered, and deeply satisfying spectacle of a monster being unmasked. His darkness dragged, kicking and screaming, into the unforgiving light. The catharsis was absolute, a collective exhalation of breath that had been held. For a quarter of a century, the ghost of Paranporth Beach was no longer just a tragic story. She had a name, a face, and now she had justice. The trial of Julian Croft was a formality. His confession, detailed and chilling, combined with the video evidence, left no room for doubt. He was sentenced to life in prison, with a recommendation that he should never be released. The legal proceedings were the cold, hard punctuation mark at the end of a story written in pain and secrets. But the true aftermath, the emotional echo of the tragedy, resonated far beyond the courtroom walls. Leela was finally laid to rest. Not in the cold, anonymous sand of Paranporth, but in a small, quiet churchyard in a village just outside Bristol, where Chloe lived and where Sarah and Mark had decided to settle, to be near the only family they had left. The funeral was a small, private affair. There were no media, no crowds, just a handful of people standing under a grey, weeping sky. Arthur Penelagon was there. DCI Vance had personally invited him. He stood at the back, his hat in his hands, a quiet, stooped figure who had been the unlikely catalyst for it all. The gravestone was simple, made of pale Cornish granite. It read, Leela Stern, 1987 to 1994. Forever, our light. And beneath the words, carved into the stone, were 5 small, familiar shapes: a seashell, a starfish, a dolphin, a lighthouse, and a heart. Her bracelet, her story, etched into her final resting place. After the service, Sarah approached Arthur. Her face was no longer the mask of haunted grief from the old photographs. The lines of pain were still there, etched deep, but her eyes held a new clarity, a profound, soul-deep weariness that had replaced the frantic agony of not knowing. Mr. Penelagon, she said, her voice soft. There are no words to thank you. You gave us the truth. It was a terrible truth, but it was the truth. It allowed us to bring her home. Arthur simply nodded, unable to speak, his throat tight with emotion. He had never sought thanks. He was just a man who listened to the whispers of the past. He had simply found what was lost. The aftermath for the 3 central figures was a study in quiet healing and haunting reflection. For David Kelsey, the public vindication was a liberation. The fear that had defined his adult life receded, replaced by a quiet confidence. He returned to his job, but he was a different man. The meticulous, risk-averse accountant had found a strength he never knew he possessed. He had faced the monster from his childhood and had not flinched. He sold his sterile apartment in Reading and bought a small house with a garden. He started birdwatching again, his binoculars no longer a tool for hiding, but a way of seeing the world. He had paid his debt, and his ledger was finally, blessedly, clear. For Chloe and Sarah, the aftermath was a slow, painful, but ultimately hopeful reconstruction of their shattered bond. The truth about their father's financial secrets, the lies that had underpinned their family, was a bitter pill, but it was also a strange kind of glue. It allowed them to see each other not as archetypes, the grieving mother, the guilty sister, but as two women who had survived an unimaginable trauma, each in their own way. They began to talk, really talk, for the first time in 25 years. They talked about Lila, not as a ghost, but as the bright, funny, wonderful child she had been. They shared memories, they cried, they even, eventually, laughed. The wall between them was gone, and in its place, they began to build a fragile bridge of shared history and renewed love. Chloe went back to teaching, her experience giving her a new depth of empathy for the small, vulnerable children in her care. She was no longer running from her past, she was using it to build a better future. The town of Paramporth began to heal, too. The beach, for so long a place of sorrow and suspicion, slowly reclaimed its identity. The story of Leela Stern was no longer a ghost story whispered in the dark. It was a tragedy that had been faced, a wound that had been cleansed. The tourists still came, the children still built sandcastles, but there was a new reverence for the place, a sense of history that was both sad and sacred. Arthur Penelagon returned to his quiet routine. He still swept the dunes with his Garrett Ace 250, the high, sweet song of the detector, a familiar comfort. But something had changed in him. His fines, the shillings and the buttons, seemed less significant now. He had found the most important thing he would ever find. He had given a name back to a lost soul. One evening, a year after the trial, he was walking on the beach at sunset, the same stretch of sand where he had made his discovery. The tide was low, the wet sand glowing orange and violet. He wasn't detecting, just walking, his hands in his pockets. He saw a young family, a mother, a father, and a little girl of about 7 or 8, packing up their things. The little girl was laughing, her face bright with sun and happiness. As she ran past him, he saw a flash of silver on her wrist. A small charm bracelet. He stopped, his heart giving a familiar, painful kick. The girl's mother saw him looking. She smiled, a friendly, open smile. "It's a new tradition we have," she said, her voice warm. "A lot of the local families do it now. A little silver bracelet, for the girl who was lost here. A way of remembering. A way of keeping our own lights safe." Arthur looked at the little girl, her bracelet winking in the last rays of the sun, and he saw the true, lingering, emotional echo of the story. Lila's light had been extinguished, but the memory of it had created 1,000 tiny new lights in its place. The darkness had not won. It had been exposed, and in its place was a community bound by a shared memory, a shared promise to never forget. He stood on the beach for a long time, long after the family had gone, watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. The sound of the surf was a gentle, rhythmic sigh. It no longer sounded like a tomb, it sounded like a lullaby. The ghost of Paramporth Beach had finally been laid to rest. The haunting was over. In its place was a bittersweet healing, a quiet acknowledgement of the terrible cost of truth, and a tragic, beautiful reminder that even the smallest light, once it has shone, can never truly be extinguished. The echo of Leela's life was not in the darkness of her death, but in the love that remembered her, in the justice that honored her, and in the silver bracelets that flashed on a summer's evening, a silent, shimmering promise to the sea and the sky.